It was a bustling night at Sabores da Alma, a restaurant that epitomized the pinnacle of sophistication in São Paulo. The aroma of meticulously prepared dishes lingered in the air, while animated conversations filled the luxuriously decorated dining room. Well-dressed patrons occupied the tables, engaging beneath the soft lighting that highlighted the golden details of the furnishings. This space was not just a restaurant. For many, it symbolized a place where status and power were reaffirmed through exclusive culinary experiences. But that night, the true value of Sabores da Alma would be put to the test in an unexpected way. Mauro Silveira, the visionary behind the restaurant's success, was a man whose footsteps echoed the resilience of his journey. Born in the outskirts of São Paulo, he grew up amidst the hardships imposed by a system seemingly determined to limit him. From an early age, Mauro felt the weight of racial prejudice. With each attempt to stand out, to be heard, he encountered invisible barriers that seemed to say, "This space is not for you." But Mauro was driven by something stronger than his struggles, a relentless desire to prove to the world that talent and determination know no color. After years of hard work, Mauro transformed Sabores da Alma into a prestigious refuge. But something troubled him. Despite his efforts to create an inclusive space, he wondered if the values he championed were genuinely upheld when he was not present. So, on an ostensibly ordinary night, Mauro decided to do something no one expected. He put on worn-out clothes, intentionally dirtied his skin, and transformed himself into someone who would not be easily recognized. His plan was simple: enter the restaurant as a complete stranger and observe how he would be treated. Mauro's entrance was a shock to the environment. The man, with a humble appearance, seemed out of place in that carefully curated setting. Eyes quickly turned, some in disdain, others in discomfort. Discreet murmurs spread across the tables as patrons averted their gazes, as if Mauro's mere presence made them feel vulnerable. Prejudice, often hidden behind smiles and formalities, was now fully exposed. Mauro walked confidently through the dining room, but inside he felt the impact of every judgmental stare. One of the waiters, José, approached him with an expression of impatience. It was the same José whom Mauro had hired years earlier, believing in his potential. However, at that moment, José did not see the man who had given him the opportunity to change his life. He saw only an intruder who, in his eyes, had no place there. "I'm sorry, sir, but we are fully booked tonight," José said, his tone making it clear that his intention was not to help. Mauro tried to explain that he only wanted a glass of water, but José turned away before he could finish his sentence. Mauro's experience was a clear portrayal of racial prejudice. He knew that his skin color, combined with his disheveled appearance, automatically placed him in a category many avoided. Studies show that, even in public spaces, black individuals face heightened scrutiny, are more frequently approached with suspicion, and are less likely to receive courteous treatment. This reality was palpable for Mauro that night. As he attempted to approach a table where a couple was dining, he heard something he would never forget. "People like you don't belong here," one of the patrons said, without even looking him in the eye. That phrase echoed like a sentence, revealing the chasm that still existed between the image of social progress and the reality of exclusion that many people face. Mauro realized that even in a space he had designed to be welcoming, the structures of discrimination were still deeply rooted. Racial prejudice does not always manifest in grand acts of discrimination, but also in daily microaggressions, suspicious looks, seemingly innocuous comments, doors closed without explanation. Mauro was feeling something that many face every day: the constant need to prove they are worthy of respect, opportunities, and humanity. As the night went on, Mauro was pushed to the corners of the dining room, as if he were a problem to be forgotten. He tried to approach the manager, Ricardo, who was known for his rigidity. Upon turning to see Mauro, Ricardo immediately displayed irritation. "You can't stay here. Leave before I call security," he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Ricardo had no idea he was speaking to the man who had entrusted him with the restaurant's management. Mauro knew that this experiment was just beginning, but at that moment he felt the weight of what he was witnessing. He was not just another victim of racial prejudice, he was a mirror reflecting what many choose not to see. The decision to continue in his disguise was painful, but he knew he needed to see it through to expose the truth. What Mauro experienced that night was a sample of what countless individuals face daily. Racial prejudice is not merely an individual issue, it is a structural problem, rooted in centuries of inequality and exclusion. The idea that appearances determine a person's worth is one of the cruelest facets of this reality. And as he walked through his own restaurant, being treated as someone undeserving of being there, Mauro saw clearly that there was still much work to be done. Mauro's story was not just his own. It was the story of thousands who, every day, struggled to be seen and treated with dignity. And that night, he decided he would use his position to expose the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be for those around him. The journey he began disguised as a homeless man was, in fact, a pathway to revealing the prejudice many pretend does not exist, but which permeates even the most sophisticated spaces. By the end of that night, Mauro knew that his revelation would not only be about who he was, but about what everyone there could learn from that experience. Racial prejudice is not a fault of a few. It is a responsibility for all to combat. Mauro walked through the dining room of Sabores de Alma, disguised as a man on the streets, feeling the weight of how society treats those who, apparently, have less. The restaurant he had built with such effort now seemed a hostile and exclusionary space. As he was ignored by the staff and scorned by the patrons, Mauro realized something that went beyond personal discrimination: how deeply social inequality shaped human interactions. Poverty is often seen not just as an economic condition, but as a mark that relegates people to a state of invisibility. For Mauro, that night became a reflection of how Brazil, one of the most unequal countries in the world, deals with social differences. He felt the weight of judgment in every gaze, leading him to reflect on how inequality is not just a matter of income, but of dignity denied. In Brazil, over 30 million people live below the poverty line, and many others face daily struggles to access basic necessities like food, housing, and healthcare. These numbers, while shocking, do not convey the true experience of those living on the margins. Mauro was now temporarily experiencing what it meant to be treated as the other, someone who deserves neither attention, respect, nor compassion. With each step he took, the reality became clearer. Mauro tried to approach a table where a couple was dining, but before he could say anything, he was repelled with disdain. "Go find another corner to beg." That phrase, delivered casually, served as a reminder of how poverty is not just neglected, it is actively rejected. Such reactions are not uncommon. Studies show that in many places, vulnerable individuals face institutional discrimination, being constantly removed from public spaces or even criminalized for being there. Mauro also recalled times before he found success, when he had to deal with similar situations. He had been excluded from job interviews simply because of where he lived, or for not wearing appropriate clothing. Now, observing his own restaurant, he saw the same pattern. The manager, Ricardo, whom he trusted to maintain an inclusive environment, merely echoed the behaviors of social exclusion. Unaware of who Mauro was, Ricardo saw him only as a problem to be eliminated. That night, Mauro began to perceive something even deeper. Poverty is not just about a lack of resources, but about a lack of opportunities and recognition. Even those striving to escape this condition face constant challenges to be accepted in spaces where they do not belong. He remembered when he opened the restaurant and insisted on hiring people with challenging backgrounds, believing that by offering a chance, he could change lives. But now, seeing employees like Jose and Ricardo reproducing exclusionary attitudes, Mauro questioned whether simply providing jobs was enough. Brazil is marked by extremes. While it boasts one of the largest economies in the world, entire communities live in precarious conditions, lacking access to basic sanitation, quality education, or security. These extremes create a culture of segregation that Mauro observed manifest manifesting subtly yet forcefully within his own restaurant. The luxurious dining room, with its dark wooden furniture and golden details, seemed designed to repel anyone who did not fit the ideal of elegance it represented. Mauro saw how the clients, surrounded by comfort, became indifferent to anything that might remind them of the realities outside that bubble. For many, poverty was a distant concept, something that existed out there in the news, but not in their privileged space. As Mauro wandered through the dining room, he felt like an intruder in his own home. The irony of this experience was inescapable. He, who had so often faced closed doors due to his socioeconomic status, now saw the same barriers being erected in a place he had built to break them down. Poverty is not just a matter of having less. It is also about not being seen, not being heard, not being respected. Mauro realized that the experience of poverty came with a loss of humanity in the eyes of others. He was no longer Mauro Silveira, the visionary entrepreneur. He was merely a homeless person, someone whose presence was tolerated with discomfort and rejected without hesitation. The social inequality Mauro witnessed that night was a reminder of how societal structures perpetuate cycles of exclusion. For someone living in poverty, every social interaction can serve as a reminder of their position in the invisible hierarchy that governs human behavior. Mauro knew that revealing his true identity would likely change the attitudes of those around him. But the question that troubled him was, why did they need to know who he was to treat him with respect? That night, as he faced cold stares and cutting words, Mauro decided he would not let it pass unnoticed. He understood that social inequality was a problem far larger than any one person could solve alone, but he also knew it was possible to start where he had power. The Sabores de Alma could not just be a successful restaurant. It needed to be an example of inclusion, where no one, regardless of their appearance or condition, felt unwelcome. What began as a personal test for Mauro was transforming into a powerful lesson about each person's role in perpetuating inequality. Poverty is not a fixed state. It is a condition that can be overcome with access to opportunities. However, to achieve that, the barriers constructed by society based on appearances and prejudices must be dismantled. Mauro left the restaurant that night still in disguise, but with a renewed vision. He knew that what he had witnessed was not just a reflection of his restaurant, but of the world around him. Social inequality is not merely a matter of a lack of resources. It is about how we see and treat one another. And as he walked through the streets of São Paulo, he resolved to use this experience to provoke real change, not just in his restaurant, but for everyone he encountered. Mauro Silveira understood, better than most, the transformative power of education. In his journey, he had faced countless barriers, many of them created by a lack of access to learning opportunities. Growing up in the outskirts of São Paulo, he witnessed firsthand how the absence of quality educational resources trapped talented young people in cycles of inequality. For Mauro, Sabores da Alma was not just a restaurant. It was also a space where he could offer opportunities to people who, like him, just needed a chance to thrive. As he wandered through the dining room that night, disguised as a man on the streets, Mauro reflected on the employees he had hired over the years. He had always taken pride in giving jobs to people from humble backgrounds, often without experience or education. José was one of those cases. Before working at the restaurant, José was just another young man with few prospects, trapped in a neighborhood where the lack of schools and infrastructure made any dream of social ascension almost impossible. When Mauro hired him, he saw potential in José that José himself had yet to recognize. In the early years, José was an exemplary employee, grateful for the opportunity and determined to learn everything he could. Mauro always made it a point to invest in training and development for his team, believing that the growth of the restaurant was directly tied to the growth of its employees. However, over time, Mauro noticed a change in Jose. He began to distance himself from his roots, adopting attitudes that mirrored the elitist behavior of some customers. What was once humility transformed into arrogance, and the desire to serve was replaced by a certain disdain for those he viewed as inferior. That night, Jose was one of the first to ignore Mauro. Instead of offering help or even showing compassion, he turned his back, preferring to avoid the shame of being associated with a man who appeared humble. For Mauro, that moment was painful. He wondered where he had gone wrong. Why had someone who had once known the hardships of poverty allowed himself to replicate the same disdain he had likely suffered? Mauro knew the answer was partially related to the lack of an education that transcended technical learning. It wasn't enough to teach skills or provide a job. It was essential to teach values, cultivate empathy, and create an environment where everyone understood that individual success could not be built at the expense of someone else's dignity. The impact of education goes far beyond the classroom. Research shows that people with access to quality education are more likely to develop critical skills, such as problem-solving, teamwork, and understanding different perspectives. But when education is limited, as is the case in many contexts of poverty, these opportunities for personal and social growth also become scarce. Mauro knew that in Brazil, the inequalities in access to education were glaring. In many peripheral areas, schools lack basic infrastructure, well-paid teachers, and updated teaching materials. Children growing up in these conditions face enormous disadvantages from the start, competing in a system that favors those with more resources. Education, which should be the greatest social equalizer, often ends up reinforcing inequalities. Yet Mauro also believed that education didn't have to be confined to formal schools. He saw in Sabores da Alma an opportunity to create an environment where education could happen in a practical and meaningful way. From the beginning, he insisted on training programs for his employees, encouraging them to learn about service, culinary skills, and even financial management. He knew that by investing in his employees, he was not only improving the restaurant, but also planting seeds of change that could transform their lives outside of work. That night, as Mauro watched Jose and other employees act with coldness and disdain, he realized that the education he had provided may not have reached the necessary depth. It wasn't just about teaching technical skills, it was about cultivating a culture of respect and empathy, something that seemed to be lacking at that moment. Amanda, the young waitress who was the only one to treat Mauro with kindness, represented the opposite of this reality. Coming from a modest family, she did not have the best educational conditions, but she demonstrated emotional intelligence and a sense of humanity that impressed Mauro. She didn't hesitate to offer help to the man who seemed to need it, even without knowing who he was. For Mauro, Amanda was proof that true education was not limited to diplomas or training, but manifested in the attitudes and values that each person brought with them. The contrast between Amanda and Jose raised an important question for Mauro. How could he create an environment where all employees could develop not only their technical skills, but also their character? He knew it was necessary to go beyond the basics, offering programs that addressed issues such as prejudice, inequality, and the importance of seeing the humanity in every person. Mauro also reflected on how opportunities were distributed unevenly. For many, like Amanda and Jose, a job at Sabores da Alma was more than just an income. It was a chance to escape the limitations imposed by their circumstances. But to make the most of these opportunities, there needed to be a continuous effort to create an environment where everyone felt valued and encouraged to grow. That night, Mauro made a decision. He knew he needed to do more than just provide jobs. He needed to transform Sabores da Alma into a space where education was a central pillar, not just in terms of practical skills, but also in human values. He wanted every employee to understand that respect and empathy were as important as mastering culinary or service techniques. As he left the restaurant, still in disguise, Mauro felt a mix of frustration and determination. He knew that education was the key to breaking the cycles of inequality he had witnessed throughout his life. And that night, he decided that he would do everything in his power to ensure that Sabores da Alma was not just a restaurant, but a true space of transformation. His experience had shown him that while opportunities can be offered, it is education, in the broadest sense of the word, that transforms those opportunities into real and lasting change. As Mauro wandered disguised through the dining area of Sabores da Alma, something began to stand out to him beyond the looks of disdain and cutting remarks. The visceral connection between physical appearance and the treatment received. Dressed as a homeless man, he felt firsthand how society tends to judge and treat people based on their appearance. What impacted him the most was not just the prejudice itself, but the automatic association between a disheveled exterior and a lack of value or character. Health and well-being, he realized, were not just individual concerns. They were also a kind of social code. The purposely dirty skin, worn-out clothes, and feigned exhaustion in his gaze made those around him see him as something unwanted, a threat to the aesthetic perfection of the restaurant. Mauro knew this experience was not unique. Millions of vulnerable people face similar judgments daily. Appearance, in this context, becomes a barrier that separates those who deserve to be treated with dignity from those relegated to forgetfulness. He couldn't help but think of the disparities he faced throughout his life. Growing up in an impoverished community, Mauro recalled the struggles he and his family faced in accessing basic health care. As he walked through the hall that night, he saw reflected in his own image the faces of so many others who, due to inequality, are deprived not only of health, but also of the chance to feel good about themselves. Alarming data from Brazil shows that while a small portion of the population has access to private clinics and advanced treatments, the majority relies on the public health system, which is often overwhelmed and unable to meet demand. Mauro knew this intimately. He had spent hours in lines at health clinics, waiting for care for problems that, in other contexts, would be resolved in minutes. He understood that this experience shaped the relationship many people had with their own bodies and the world around them. However, that night, Mauro realized that it was not just the lack of access to physical health that mattered. He felt how the absence of emotional and psychological well-being also played a crucial role in social exclusion. The tired appearance he wore as part of his disguise seemed to communicate to others that he was not in a position to be treated with empathy. Mauro saw how, in such situations, well-being was more than just the absence of illness. It was about feeling worthy of occupying a space, of being seen, heard, and respected. The looks from the customers hit him like silent arrows. Ricardo's words, the manager, echoed in his mind. "You can't be here." Mauro reflected on how the concept of well-being was often associated with privilege. To dine at a restaurant like Sabores da Alma, it was expected that customers not only have financial resources, but also an appearance and behavior that signaled success. This created an invisible line, separating those who could participate in that environment from those deemed a threat to its aesthetic. Mauro thought of Amanda, the only employee who had shown empathy and offered help. Unlike the others, Amanda didn't seem bothered by his appearance. Her simple gesture of bringing him a glass of water and asking if he needed anything else was proof that even in a system that dehumanized people based on their appearance, there were still those who could see beyond. Amanda likely knew instinctively that well-being starts with respect. He also considered the psychological impact that exclusion had on people. Mauro knew that for those who faced such situations daily, silent disdain could be as harmful as a lack of medical care. Studies show that lack of access to mental health services is one of the greatest challenges faced by vulnerable populations. Without proper support, people often carry the weight of stigma and isolation, which further exacerbates their condition. For Mauro, this was a personal issue. He understood how self-esteem and self-perception were affected by the way others treated him. When he was younger, before achieving success, he often felt ashamed to ask for help, not because he didn't need it, but because he knew he would be judged. That night, he saw the reflection of this in the looks he received. By putting himself in the shoes of those facing these barriers daily, Mauro understood that health and well-being were not just about caring for the body, but about restoring dignity. As he walked back to the kitchen, Mauro felt a mix of sadness and determination. He knew that Sabores da Alma needed to become more than just an elegant restaurant. He wanted to create a space where everyone, regardless of their appearance, would be treated with respect and warmth. He recalled a customer who once complained about an employee for not being up to par with the environment. At the time, Mauro had given in to the pressure to avoid conflict, but now he realized that moment was a turning point. The well-being of his staff and customers should be a priority, but he also knew he needed to confront the structures that perpetuated exclusion. Mauro began to think of ways to transform his restaurant into a symbol of inclusion. Perhaps he could initiate programs to support employees facing mental health challenges, or even create events to raise awareness about health and well-being. That night, as he left the restaurant still in his disguise, Mauro made an important decision. He knew he couldn't change the world alone, but he could start by transforming the environment around him. He wanted Sabores da Alma to be a space where health and well-being were seen as rights, not privileges. A place where no one would be judged by their appearance, but welcomed for their humanity. Mauro also realized that this transformation needed to start with himself. He couldn't expect his team to treat others with empathy if he didn't set the example. Determined to face the challenges ahead, he promised himself that he would make Sabores da Alma a place where well-being was part of the experience, not just something reserved for those who could afford it. That night, Mauro not only saw the flaws in his restaurant, he also saw the opportunity to create something larger and more meaningful. As Mauro circulated through the dining room of Sabores da Alma, disguised as a man experiencing homelessness, he couldn't help but reflect on something far beyond his personal experience. The restaurant he had worked so hard to build was not only a symbol of his journey, but also a space of opportunity. However, that night, he realized that the relationship between employment, income, and dignity was much more complex than he had imagined. From the beginning, Mauro had always believed in the transformative power of providing jobs. He had faced difficulties entering the job market himself, being constantly rejected not for lack of ability, but due to inappropriate appearance or prejudices associated with the neighborhood where he lived. Therefore, when he opened Sabores da Alma, he decided to hire people with similar struggles, believing that stable employment could be the first step towards changing lives. But that night, while being ignored by employees he himself had hired and rejected by customers he worked so hard to attract, Mauro realized that employment and income alone were not enough to transform realities. He saw Jose, the waiter who had started at the restaurant with enthusiasm, now carrying an arrogant demeanor. Jose had managed to climb the restaurant's hierarchy, but somehow he seemed to have lost the sense of empathy that once characterized him. For Mauro, this was a clear sign of how access to jobs and income, while essential, was not enough to break cycles of inequality. Often people are shaped by the structures around them, adopting behaviors and attitudes that reflect the expectations of their environment. In José's case, financial success seemed to have generated a disconnect from his own origins, making him reproduce the same prejudices that had once affected him. Mauro knew that Brazil was a country where income inequality not only limited access to opportunities, but also perpetuated a culture of exclusion. Recent data showed that the 10 richest people in the country possessed the same wealth as half of the Brazilian population. This extreme disparity made well-paying jobs seem almost like a utopia in many communities. Mauro was familiar with this reality and understood the transformative impact that a fair salary could have. Still, the issue was not just economic. Mauro began to reflect on the role of work as a source of dignity. The German philosopher Karl Marx once said that work is an extension of the human being, a way for us to express ourselves and give meaning to our lives. However, for many, Work was merely a draining obligation, performed under inhumane conditions and without any recognition. Mauro knew that this needed to change. He thought of Amanda, the young waitress who had shown empathy by offering him a glass of water. Amanda, unlike Jose, had not allowed the pressures of the environment to divert her from her values. Mauro realized that Amanda saw work as something more than just a source of income. She viewed it as an opportunity to make a difference, to touch people's lives, even through small gestures. This difference in perspective made him think about how to create an environment where work was more than an obligation. It was a chance for personal and collective growth. That night, Mauro saw how employment and income were connected to something even deeper, the feeling of belonging. He remembered when, as a young man, he got his first job as a kitchen assistant in a small restaurant. The pay was low and the working conditions were tough, but the job gave him something he had never felt before, the sense that he had a place in the world. For Mauro, work was a way to build bridges, to connect people to a larger purpose. But what he witnessed that night showed that not everyone saw work in the same light. For many, employment was just a means to an end, with income being the only indicator of success. Mauro knew that to change this mindset, he would need to transform Sabores da Alma into a space where employees felt not just employed, but also valued as individuals. He began to think of ways to create a more inclusive and collaborative environment. Perhaps he could implement profit-sharing programs where employees felt part of the restaurant's financial success. Or maybe he could organize workshops that not only trained technical skills, but also fostered discussions about values and purpose. That night, Mauro also recognized how access to quality jobs was still a privilege for many. He thought of the countless resumes he received from young people full of potential, but who had never had the chance to prove their worth. He wondered how many Mauros were scattered throughout the city, waiting for a chance to show what they were capable of. Sabores da Alma could not just be a restaurant, it had to be a space for transformation. Mauro decided he would use his position to create a business model that not only generated profits, but also promoted equity and inclusion. He knew that if he wanted to make a difference, he had to start with his own team, showing that work was not just a way to make a living, but a way to build a better future for everyone. As Mauro prepared to conclude his undercover experience that night, he felt a mix of frustration and hope. Frustration at seeing how the structures of inequality still shaped interactions in the restaurant, but hope in knowing that he had the power to do something about it. He resolved that Sabores da Alma would be more than a successful business. It would be a living example of how employment and income, when combined with values and purpose, could transform lives. As Mauro Silveira walked through the dining room of Sabores da Alma, his disguise as a beggar evoked immediate and intense reactions. He was not merely ignored or scorned. His presence was seen as an invasion, a threat to the sophisticated atmosphere of the restaurant. Mauro perceived in every glance and gesture the silent violence of a society that rejects and marginalizes those who do not fit its standards. But there was something darker at play, the almost automatic association between a humble appearance and criminality. Brazil, he knew, was a country where violence and crime directly affected the poorest, but not in the way many imagined. For many, like those customers in the restaurant, poverty was seen as a source of danger, something to be kept at a distance. This perception, however, ignored a harsh reality. People in vulnerable situations are, in fact, the greatest victims of violence. They live in communities where the presence of the state is scarce, if not non-existent, and where crime often emerges as the only visible alternative for survival. That night, Mauro experienced a different form of violence, not physical, but deeply corrosive. He was chased away, reprimanded, and at one point threatened by Ricardo, the restaurant manager. "You can't stay here. Get out before I call security." These words echoed in Mauro's mind as a reminder of how many times he had been treated as someone who did not belong in certain spaces. He knew that Ricardo's disdain wasn't just about him, but about what his appearance represented. In the eyes of many, he wasn't just a man in worn clothes. He was a potential threat, someone who carried with him the danger of poverty. Mauro reflected on how the criminalization of poverty was a persistent reality in Brazil. He recalled reports about homeless individuals who were assaulted or expelled from public spaces simply for being there. Their presence is often seen as an annoyance, something that needs to be resolved, not with help, but with force. This hostility is not only social, but also institutional. Studies show that black and poor individuals are disproportionately targeted by law enforcement, often without apparent reason, simply for being in places deemed inappropriate for them. As Mauro watched the restaurant's security approach, he thought about how many times he had seen news stories of people being forcibly removed from places where they sought shelter or food. He realized that violence wasn't just about extreme acts. It was also about the small daily actions that reinforced exclusion and isolation. Ricardo, with his severe tone and rigid posture, was a clear example of how these attitudes were normalized, even in environments where respect should be the rule. However, Mauro also understood that violence was not just something he observed from the outside. He recognized that in underprivileged communities, it was often impossible to escape it. He remembered his youth, when living in a neighborhood marked by inequality meant coexisting with constant fear. It wasn't just the fear of crime, but also the fear of being mistaken for a criminal. Mauro knew that for many young people in situations like his, involvement with crime was not a choice, but a lack of alternatives. When opportunities are scarce and survival is uncertain, paths that once seemed unthinkable can become the only visible way out. As he turned his thoughts back to the restaurant, Mauro realized that even there, in the heart of the city, violence manifested in subtle ways. The indifference of the staff, the contempt of the customers, and Ricardo's hostility were expressions of a system that perpetuated exclusion and discrimination. He saw how crime was often used as a justification for violent acts against the most vulnerable. The mere assumption that he might be dangerous, based solely on his appearance, was enough to trigger defensive and even aggressive reactions. But Mauro also knew that violence didn't have to be the end of the story. He believed that Sabores da Alma could be a space for transformation, a place where prejudices and assumptions could be challenged. He began to think of ways to address the issue of violence constructively. Perhaps he could organize events at the restaurant to discuss topics like inequality, crime, and social exclusion. Maybe he could use his position to highlight the stories of people who, despite facing violence in their lives, found ways to overcome it. Amanda, the young waitress who showed empathy by offering Mauro a glass of water, was an example of the kind of change he wanted to see. Her simple yet meaningful gesture demonstrated that it was possible to act with compassion even in a system that often promoted indifference. For Mauro, Amanda represented a form of resistance against the violence of contempt. He knew he needed to support people like her, who looked beyond appearances and were willing to treat everyone with dignity. Mauro also recognized that his experience disguised that night was just a glimpse of what many people faced daily. He thought of the stories he had heard from employees, friends, and even strangers about how violence, both physical and emotional, marked their lives. He knew that transforming Sabores da Alma wouldn't be easy, but he also understood it was necessary. If he wanted to create a truly inclusive space, he would need to confront not only the prejudices of his staff and customers, but also his own. That night, Mauro made a decision. He knew that Sabores da Alma couldn't be just a high-end restaurant. It needed to be a space where all people, regardless of their appearance or social condition, felt safe and welcome. He promised himself that he would use his position to combat violence in all its forms, from silent hostility to more explicit actions. And above all, he vowed to make his restaurant an example of how humanity can prevail over prejudice and exclusion. As he left the restaurant that night, still in disguise, Mauro felt the weight of what he had witnessed, but also the hope that real changes were possible. He knew that the fight against violence and crime was not just a matter of safety, but of creating a world where everyone was treated with respect and dignity. And as he walked through the streets of São Paulo, Mauro promised that he would do everything in his power to transform Sabores da Alma into a beacon of hope and humanity in a world often marked by indifference. While Mauro Silveira experienced rejection in his own restaurant, disguised as a homeless man, he confronted a painful reality: how society chooses who is worthy of being seen, heard, and valued. What troubled him the most was not just the indifference of his staff and customers, but the fact that, in a space he had created, the values of inclusion and respect he had always championed did not seem to be upheld. It was then that he began to reflect on something that had always been fundamental to him: representativity. Mauro knew that his presence as a black businessman from a humble background was, in itself, a way to break barriers. From the beginning of his career, he faced skeptical looks, veiled jokes, and underestimation. Many didn't believe that someone like him could achieve success in such an elitist field as high-end gastronomy. But Mauro persisted. He understood that each of his achievements was not just personal, it was also a reminder to other young black, marginalized, and peripheral individuals that they too could occupy spaces traditionally closed to them. That night, however, disguised and invisible to everyone, Mauro felt the weight of something even deeper. He realized that it wasn't enough to just be at the top. It was necessary to ensure that representativity manifested concretely at all levels. It wasn't just about him, but about who he brought with him, who he inspired, and how he used his position to open doors for others. Amanda, the young waitress who showed compassion by offering him a glass of water, was the perfect example of how representation could impact lives in a practical way. Amanda came from a modest family and, like Mauro in his early days, understood what it meant to be judged by appearance or underestimated because of her background. However, she also carried something that Mauro deeply valued: the ability to see beyond appearances. Amanda didn't know she was standing in front of the restaurant owner, but still chose to treat Mauro with dignity. This simple yet powerful gesture revealed to him the transformative potential she held, the kind of attitude that could inspire greater change. Mauro pondered how he could use his position to enhance representation not only in his team, but throughout the entire experience that Sabores da Alma offered. He began to envision a restaurant that not only reflected diversity in its hiring practices, but also celebrated this diversity in its essence. From the menu to the decor and the stories shared with customers, Mauro wanted every detail to convey the message that everyone was welcome and valued there. He also considered how representation goes beyond mere presence. Studies show that when people from different backgrounds have the opportunity to occupy prominent roles, it creates a ripple effect. Young people who see someone like them in leadership roles feel more confident to dream and pursue their own goals. Mauro knew that for many, he was that example, a black entrepreneur who had defied the odds. But he also understood that he needed to do more to create opportunities for others to follow that path. One of the plans Mauro began to formulate that night was to create a mentorship program within Sabores da Alma. He wanted to identify employees like Amanda, people with potential but without the necessary tools or connections to advance, and help them grow. It wasn't just about technical training, it was about investing in their stories, offering support, and showing them that they too could be leaders. Additionally, Mauro wanted to use the restaurant as a platform to amplify voices that often went unheard. He imagined themed nights where artists and chefs from marginalized communities could share their cultures, stories, and talents. For Mauro, this was a way to transform Sabores da Alma into something bigger than a high-end dining space, a place where representation was celebrated in all its forms. He also recognized that representation had a direct impact on the customer experience. When people enter a restaurant and see staff and stories that reflect the diversity of the world around them, they feel more connected to the space. Mauro wanted Sabores da Alma to be a place where anyone, regardless of their background, color, or social class, could feel at home. That night, as Mauro observed customers interacting with indifference to his presence, he felt the urgency to accelerate these changes. He knew that representation was not just a matter of social justice, it was a matter of humanity. When we make space for everyone to be seen and heard, we create a richer, more vibrant, and fairer world. Mauro left the restaurant still in disguise, but with renewed determination. He knew the road ahead would be long, but he also understood that he had the responsibility to lead by example. Representation was not just about him being there, it was about ensuring that others could also occupy those spaces and, more importantly, feel that they belonged there. As he walked through the streets of São Paulo that night, Mauro reflected on the journey that had brought him to that moment. He remembered the times he was doubted, the doors that were closed, and the looks that denied him dignity. But he also recalled every victory, every small step that led him to where he was now. And, above all, he remembered why he started, to show that everyone has value, that everyone deserves to be seen, and that representation is not just an ideal. It is an urgent necessity in a world that still insists on excluding. With this purpose in mind, Mauro promised that Sabores da Alma would not just be a restaurant. It would be a space where stories like his, Amanda's, and many others could be celebrated and amplified. Because in the end, representation is not just about who is at the table. It is about ensuring that everyone has a seat to sit in. As Mauro walked out of the restaurant that night, still in disguise, his mind was flooded with thoughts. He couldn't ignore the feeling that everything he had witnessed was a reflection of something much larger than Sabores da Alma. The exclusion, prejudice, discrimination, and indifference he experienced were not just individual problems. They were symptoms of a system that perpetuated inequalities and limited opportunities for many. For Mauro, it became clear that changing attitudes was important, but to create lasting impact, it was essential to promote structural changes. Mauro understood that unequal structures shaped every aspect of society, from access to education and healthcare to opportunities for social mobility. He had seen this throughout his life, starting from his days in an overcrowded public school, where a lack of resources made it nearly impossible to dream beyond the obvious. Even after achieving success as a businessman, he felt how the system was designed to favor those who already had privileges while hindering the progress of those starting from scratch. Structural inequality was not just something he knew, it was something he lived. Mauro reflected on how in his journey he had to overcome invisible barriers that others didn't even know existed. He knew that the restaurant, as a microcosm of society, also reproduced these dynamics. The implicit hierarchy among employees, the way customers treated those less fortunate, and even the management decisions he made, all contributed to perpetuating an unequal system. That night, Mauro decided that he could no longer accept that Sabores da Alma was just another piece of that unjust puzzle. He needed to transform it into a space that reflected the values he had always stood for: inclusion, equality, and respect. But for that, he knew he needed to go beyond small symbolic actions. He needed to restructure the restaurant from the inside out. As Mauro walked home, he began to formulate a plan. He knew that structural changes needed to be deeper than just campaigns or one-off events. They had to tackle the root of the problems. He thought about how he could redistribute responsibilities and power within the restaurant so that all employees felt part of the decision-making process. Perhaps he could implement a regular feedback system where every team member, regardless of their position, would have the opportunity to share ideas and concerns. Additionally, Mauro wanted to rethink hiring practices. He decided that Sabores da Alma should become a model of active inclusion, prioritizing candidates from underrepresented groups. He envisioned training programs that would not only provide technical skills, but also help employees grow personally and tackle structural challenges outside of work. Mauro also realized that, to promote real change, he needed to engage customers in this conversation. He began to imagine how he could use the restaurant as a platform to educate people about the importance of questioning biases and supporting inclusive practices. Maybe he could create events where customers and employees shared their stories, fostering a deeper understanding among everyone. He knew that structural change was not just an internal issue, but also about raising awareness and involving the surrounding community. At the same time, Mauro understood that he would face resistance. Structural changes inherently challenge the status quo, and many people prefer the comfort of maintaining things as they are. He knew that employees like Ricardo, the manager who had treated Mauro with disdain that night, might not easily accept a new approach. However, Mauro was determined. He believed it was possible to show everyone, including Ricardo, that these changes were not only necessary but also beneficial for all. Mauro also began to reflect on the impact of the changes he planned beyond the walls of the restaurant. He knew that Sabores de Alma had the potential to inspire other businesses and even entire communities to rethink their practices. If he could transform his restaurant into a model of equity and inclusion, perhaps he could spark a larger movement, encouraging others to do the same. As he walked, Mauro remembered a conversation he had years ago with a mentor who said, "True change begins when you challenge what seems unchangeable." That night, those words echoed in his mind more strongly than ever. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew it was worth it. Every barrier he had faced in his life had prepared him for this moment, to lead by example and show that a fairer system was possible. When he got home, Mauro grabbed a notepad and started writing down his ideas. He jotted down plans for awareness workshops, redesigning the job structure, initiatives to support the mental health of the team, and even partnerships with community organizations to offer opportunities to at-risk youth. He knew these ideas were still in their infancy, but he felt a renewed excitement as he realized that Sabores de Alma was about to become something much bigger than he had ever imagined. The next morning, Mauro entered the restaurant with a new sense of purpose. He understood that it wouldn't be enough to demand changes from his team without first demonstrating what he was willing to do himself. So, he called a meeting with all the employees, from the chefs to the cleaning staff. He shared what he had witnessed the night before and laid out his vision for the future. With a firm yet empathetic voice, he said, "This restaurant was built on values of respect, inclusion, and dignity. But yesterday I realized that we are far from fully living these values. Starting today, that's going to change." The looks he received were a mix of surprise, apprehension, and curiosity. Some, like Amanda, showed a glimmer of hope. Others, like Ricardo, appeared skeptical, but Mauro knew that change would begin right there, in that room, with those people. He concluded by saying, "I'm not here to blame anyone. I'm here to invite all of you to join me in building something greater. Let's transform Sabores de Alma into a place that not only serves food, but also nourishes the soul." And so the first step toward a structural transformation was taken. Mauro knew it would be a long and challenging process, but he also understood that the impact would be lasting. Sabores de Alma was about to become more than just a restaurant. It was about to become a living symbol of how structural changes can transform not only a space, but also the lives it touches.